What's up, everybody? Ryan Thomas here, live on the Thomas Take Sports Podcast, live on YouTube. And over the past few days, I've had the pleasure of communicating and interacting with plenty of great guests on this show. Samuel White's joined me a time or two. Tom Wujek has joined me. Brennan Koch has joined me. Stephanie Wilson has joined me. Lauren Lewis has joined me. Stephanie Wilson, Lauren Lewis, two fantastic guests. Along with Tom Wujek, along with Samuel White, along with many others that I plan on having on the show within the next few months. Today, Tuesday, normally I do the shows on Wednesday and Sunday, but I wanted to bring you a special edition of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast on Tuesday, a day after someone that I've met in my lifetime, I can say. Two people that I've met in my lifetime, Ariel Helwani and Rashad Evans, as Rashad Evans joined Ariel Helwani's premiere debut episode, Ariel Helwani's MMA show on ESPN. And, they got Ariel and the bad guy, Ariel Helwani, Chael Sonnen. I really liked that show. Those are two of my favorite people in the sport of MMA that cover it. I've always been a massive Chael Sonnen fan. I've always been an Ariel Helwani admirer. I admire his work. And a lot of what I have kind of tried to looked up to along the way, he's been one of those guys. And I was very, very interested to see his first show. I've watched his previous show, MMA Hour, for the last 10 years. And Ariel had the Who's Who, as usual, on his show. And the Who's Who featured a man that I've also met in former UFC light heavyweight champion Rashad Evans. Rashad Evans is right outside my backyard. I mean, really, I was born and raised in the town of Lockport, city of Lockport. Rashad Evans, born and raised in Niagara Falls, went to a school by the name of Niagara Wheatfield, wrestled there, went on to wrestle at Niagara County Community College with Coach Eric Knudela, and who I also know, obviously. And along the way, I've just always admired his path because he was one of the guys from my town that made it into the UFC, the most prominent name easily that made it into the UFC and achieved real success, a man that I would consider a Hall of Fame UFC fighter. Rashad Evans did more for the UFC than what is really, really talked about. And I want to go back to the beginning of his career really fast. As we start here. When I remember Rashad Evans, when I really go back and remember Rashad Evans dating back to the beginning, I remember a man that was highly, highly talented, that it was obvious he had speed, he could fight at awkward angles, he could shoot a mean double leg takedown. And at the time of his retirement, he leads UFC light heavyweights with 50 takedowns landed in his UFC career. That's a remarkable statistic. 50 landed takedowns in his UFC career. Rashad fought the Who's Who. He fought Tito Ortiz. He fought Michael Bisping. He fought John Jones. He fought Lyoto Machida. He fought Forrest Griffin. He fought Rampage Jackson. He's fought the Who's Who throughout his entire career. Chuck Liddell, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But when I really look at the beginning of Rashad Evans' career, as he was known as Sugar Rashad Evans, the first thought that comes into my mind is the very beginning, a career that it was obvious when he was on season 2 of The Ultimate Fighter that he was the most talented guy in the building, that he was the fastest, he was the most hungry fighter in that house. And I don't mean he opened up the fridge a lot. I mean he was hungry. He literally wanted to win that show. He fought Brad Imes in the heavyweight final. He was fighting in that season as a heavyweight. And for him to go on to become the UFC light heavyweight champion, to have a few fights in the UFC's middleweight division, it just shows that his fight versus Brad Imes, who at the time was seen as a very dangerous man, 6'7", 260 pounds. Rashad was 5'11", 230 at most. Rashad used his speed. Rashad used his wrestling offense. and his wrestling defense to win that fight and win the Ultimate Fighter. I really can't say enough good things about Rashad Evans. The several times that I have met him, he has been the consummate professional in terms of how he interacts with fans. And I'm not referring to just me. I'm referring to when I watched him meet other fans, there was no wavering, no phoniness. Each and every individual that he met, he reacted to them in a different way. He was authentic. He was honest. And he was a true professional. And that goes a long, long way. When I look at his highest achievements in the sport, obviously he became the Ultimate Fighter winner, and he also won the UFC light heavyweight title. The fights along the way that really really made me think, wow, this guy is really special, was his first fight. Actually, not his first fight. His first fight that really made me think, wow, this guy is special, was his fight actually versus Tito Ortiz. He was very young, very green in the game. Tito Ortiz was a massive name in the sport. And that fight went to a split decision. Knowing that a Rashad that young could go, quote-unquote, distance with a former UFC light heavyweight champion, you only knew that big things were about to happen for Rashad. His next fight was against Michael the Count Bisping. That was a battle of the undefeated fight, as that was billed. Both fighters were 15-0. Bisping at the time was fighting at light heavyweight, as was Rashad Evans, obviously. And that was a really, really close fight that almost happened very recently once again, but it never came to fruition. Fought Michael Bisping back in November of 2007. That was UFC 78, as I show my head here there. September of 2008 was UFC 88, which was deemed UFC Breakthrough. And this is the real moment in Rashad Evans' career where he showed up, where he did what he needed to do, where he made things happen. And in talking to Ariel Helwani on his show, Rashad Evans said that that was the most memorable night of his career. And that was the night that that was the night that Rashad Evans showed up. That was the night that he burst onto the scene, showed the entire MMA landscape that he is legitimate, that he was the real deal, that he was the guy to be feared. And watching that fight, you could see the inevitable. You could see that Rashad was faster. You could see that Rashad was more nimble on his feet. You could see that Rashad was more athletic. You could see that Rashad was the future and that Chuck was the past. And it led to one looping right-hand knockout that was the best one-punch knockout I've ever seen in UFC history. For those of you that missed it, that haven't seen it yet, you have to check it out. You have to check it out. That was the night that Rashad Evans arrived in Atlanta, Georgia, UFC 88. It was deemed UFC Breakthrough. Shortly after that, he was granted the title shot versus the then champion Forrest Griffin. Still undefeated at the time. Was undefeated when winning the title. And his first loss in his UFC career was his first UFC title defense to Lyoto Machida, which was a devastating knockout loss for him. But to think of what he did up to that point, stayed undefeated, fought the who's who, had a draw with Tito Ortiz, had a split decision win versus Michael Bisping, then came off of that fight knocking out Chuck Liddell in the best one-punch knockout sequence I've ever seen, then defeating Forrest Griffin for the title via TKO in the third, his tough, devastating knockout loss to Lyoto Machida. He rattled off several, 4 straight wins at that point versus the likes of Thiago Silva, Quentin Rampage Jackson, Tito Ortiz again, and Phil Davis. His fight versus Quentin Jackson at the time, UFC 114 back in 2010, was the biggest grudge match at that time, one of the biggest grudge matches in UFC history. You got Anderson and Chael, you got Chuck and Tito, you got St. Pierre and Diaz is up there. St. Pierre and Sarah is up there. But I would say Rashad Evans and Quentin Rampage Jackson might be the most high-profile grudge match in UFC history, paling in comparison to Jose Aldo and Jose Aldo and Conor McGregor, paling in comparison to anything we've seen recently. Because with Rashad and Quentin Rampage Jackson, it was played out over the span of an entire reality show. We saw Rashad Evans and Quentin Jackson go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth with some of the best trash talk that I have ever heard, some of which I use in my own life as a one-liner to someone. Not when I'm not doing it, to talk trash and fight someone. I'm doing it just to joke around. But Rashad Evans and Quentin Jackson, what a hell of a grudge match that was. And that's a fight, that's an Ultimate Fighter season, the likes of which we'll never see again. We may never see the Ultimate Fighter itself again, which I'll talk about that at some point. But Rashad Evans really embodies what made the UFC great in the Fertitta era. The Fertittas were the owners of the UFC up until 2016 when they sold it to WME IMG. And with the Fertitta brothers, they put so much stock in the Ultimate Fighter. They put so much stock into those fighters, and Rashad Evans was one of those guys. Without Rashad Evans, without Forrest Griffin, without Michael Bisping, without that guard of fighters, where is the UFC right now? Are we even talking about the UFC? Are we even talking about mixed martial arts? I honestly don't know. We could be having a completely different conversation right now if it wasn't for these individuals, which is truly profound and fascinating. Another high-profile grudge match in Rashad Evans' career was at UFC 145. That took place in April of 2012. That was against John Jones. Obviously, this was coming off a win versus Phil Davis that was deemed to be a UFC light heavyweight title eliminator. And Rashad Evans wiped the floor with Phil Davis, who went on to win the Bellator light heavyweight title for a time. The fight with John Jones was a heated rivalry, one that when I first met Rashad Evans, I told him I hoped that he would win that fight, and he said, "Thanks, buddy, I'll do my best." And it didn't go his way. The night was not a good night for him, but I'm sure that payday was pretty sweet, and I'm sure that memory of that fight leading up to that event was truly, truly fantastic. One to remember. His next fight, he lost a unanimous decision to Antonio Rogerio Nogueira. And you do notice, throughout his career, he did have some layoffs. Forrest Griffin to Lyoto Machida with that title, December 2008 to May 2009. I wouldn't really consider that a layoff, but once he lost to Machida, he didn't come back until January of 2010. Fought twice in 2010, fought once in 2011, fought twice in 2012, fought 3 times in 2013, and then didn't have another performance until 2015 versus Ryan Bader, then another performance in 2016, then March of 2017, almost a year apart, almost in these instances. And as his career went on after the John Jones loss, he lost a weird, awkward fight to Antonio Rogerio Nogueira. He had a split decision victory over Dan Henderson. He had a TKO victory over Chael Sonnen. And then there were, to bookend his career, were 5 consecutive losses. And I know for a fact that's not the way Rashad wanted to go out, but this is how it works. You either go out on your face or on your back. It's very rare that a fighter ends his career on top. And Rashad would be the first to admit that. It's just the way it goes. It's the same as a football player. It's the same as a baseball player. You leave the game a shell of yourself. And I say that with love to Rashad because Rashad was smart enough to know when to stop. Some guys stick around so long they completely diminish or dent their legacy. And although Rashad Evans lost 5 of his last 5 fights, a few of those fights were very close. His fight versus Ryan Bader was close. He lost via TKO to Glover Teixeira. Who the hell has Glover Teixeira not knocked unconscious? Daniel Kelly was a split decision fight I thought he won. Sam Alvey was a split decision, a fight I thought he won. And Anthony Smith, a young gun, KO'd him via knee. That knee would knock out anybody. So I know it had to be really hard for Rashad to go out like that because that was what he was trying to avoid. He was coming back to try to get that last win and get out. And I really think these last few years he has been basically on the precipice of retirement, but he wanted to get that last win. He wanted to go out on top. And one dynamic of his career that I'm very sad about is not that he didn't end his career off of a win, but it's that he never fought in Buffalo, New York, his home city, in his home arena. He was at UFC 210 in Buffalo, which featured Daniel Cormier and Anthony Johnson, training partner of Anthony Johnson. He had a huge hand in that fight, was close to fighting on that card, but for whatever reason, the New York State Athletic Commission would not clear Rashad Evans without extensive testing. And they were going to put him on the Madison Square Garden card. That didn't happen due to those reasons. And then it was like no card in New York would be worth him going through that process again. Understandably so. So, all in all, what I can say about Rashad Evans is he represents what made the UFC great. And it is what he represents. He represents what made the UFC great, and what made the UFC great is in the rear view mirror. It's in the past. And that could be for the better or for the worse. For better or for worse, that is the case. This era of these fighters that made the UFC great, what it is today is not the same. It is commercial. It is mainstream. These fighters brought us into this era, and now it is up to the current fighters to bring it into another era. And then it's up to those fighters in that next era to bring it to another level and another level and another level, which has happened in virtually every other sports league. The NBA, Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, LeBron James, Major League Baseball, Derek Jeter, Mike Trout, NHL, Sidney Crosby, Ovechkin, McDavid, Eichel. Every single league has seen this happen. You have to have stars in every era in order to sustain and maintain success. Rashad Evans was one of those guys, one of the most successful UFC-led heavyweight fighters of all time, but furthermore, one of the best guys, one of the best people to fight in the Ultimate Fighting Championship. It was painfully obvious to me that it was a very tough interview for Rashad Evans to call it quits, as it is for any athlete, any professional athlete, whether you're a fighter, a baseball player, yada, yada, yada. It's very tough to hang it up and to know when you're done and to say that you're finished. But I am very much looking forward to what Rashad Evans has to bring to the table in the future. I'm very much looking forward to seeing him hopefully on the broadcast side of things, because he is very, very sharp. Not only is he sharp upstairs, but he's a sharp-dressed man. And that's what the UFC needs. They need a guy like him to continue his work and helping the UFC grow and helping the sport. And I know he will. He's a fantastic coach. He's had a lot of success with his training partners. His training partners have had a lot of success with him. And I'm very thankful to have met him. I'm thankful that he's from this area. I'm thankful that he had the career that he had, because he paved the way for mixed martial arts to essentially be legal in New York State. Unfortunately, he never fought here, but I know for sure, I know for one thing, he will be in the UFC Hall of Fame. He's got my vote. Take care, everybody. That was part 1 of the MMA show. We'll be right back.